Hello. Today, I'd like to talk about the missile strike on the SBU yesterday. So, the Russian Ministry of Defense is reporting that on the evening of the 28th of July, a single missile hit the SBU, the Ukrainian intelligence command center or headquarters in Dnipro, Dnepropetrovsk. This is about 50 kilometers north of the Zaporozhye city itself. This missile strike appears to have been some sort of powerful, perhaps Iskander missile. The strike, in some before and after photos, has done damage to an 8-story high building, torn the front off that, and then what seems to have obliterated maybe a 2 or 3-story area at the front. And there are reports, sort of even hours or a day later, of ongoing fires coming from deep underground. So this attack may have been a bunker busting type of missile strike. There have been confirmation from the Ukrainians that this was an SBU facility that was hit. However, the Ukrainian reports are that there were no injuries, there was no one there. This may be the case, I can't corroborate it. However, there is video footage showing multiple ambulances outside the building. There is also reports from Turkish channels reporting on Ukrainian sources that there were calls, and there are some on social media some images of calls for blood in the Dnepropetrovsk region, urgent calls for blood supplies, and reports of Polish helicopters flying into Ukraine in what appeared to be medical evacuation missions. There is also talk that it's suspected there may have been NATO resources involved or injured in this strike on the command center. Now, that would make sense if it wasn't a command center. There have been recent strikes of a similar nature with, again, very powerful sort of bunker busting bombs. As you would imagine, you would want to keep some of these people in your command centre safe, so quite likely underground, and very likely that an intelligence gathering command centre would have resources from NATO nations involved there. There's report of a second explosion on a apartment block nearby. Now, in some of the Ukrainian telegram channels, this is being reported as a second Iskander missile attack. I have some doubts that it was an Iskander attack. The damage that appears to have been done to the apartment building appears relatively small to the roof area and top 2 floors of the building. There were some initial Ukrainian reports that there were injuries and civilians had been killed. However, this seems to have been walked back, and that now there is talks that there were injuries, and that these injuries were minor. The head of the Ukrainian Ministry of Internal Affairs, Igor Klimenko, reports that 5 people were injured, but they were treated without hospitalization. This seems to back up other reports indicating that the apartment block that was damaged was in fact under construction and that people weren't yet living in it. So there don't appear to have been any civilian deaths. There does appear to have been a significant strike by a significant missile onto the SBU command center. And the claims that it's a Iskander that has hit this apartment block, I mean, the Iskanders, these are big missiles. These are fired from a mobile launch system, like a truck, a large truck, which can fire 2 of these, has 2 of these missiles on the back. They're nearly 7.5 meters long, or 24 feet long. in the old school. So, these are big missiles. I think they weigh a couple of tons each. They're hypersonic missiles. They fly upwards of Mach 6, and they carry a 700 or 800 kilogram explosive warhead on them. If you go and Google Iskander missile crater, where you can see photos of where Iskanders have hit the ground, you look at the crater they make, it's astounding. They do a massive amount of damage. They have a huge amount of kinetic energy combined with an explosive warhead. I don't believe, or I feel it was very unlikely that it was an Iskander that hit this apartment building. If it had been an Iskander that had hit the apartment building, I think that apartment building would have been leveled. Instead, it has suffered some damage to the top couple of floors. What is being reported, and what does appear to be more likely, is that this second explosion was probably a failed air defense missile. Air defense missile that was unable to strike its target and has crashed and exploded in a residential area. Now, there's been multiple reports of this happening recently in Odessa, the church. Again, similar things with the church. There were claims by the Ukrainians that this was a massive, perhaps an Iskander attack by the Russians on the church. Again, had that been an Iskander attack on the church would have been leveled. There wouldn't be people walking through there in the hours afterwards, cleaning up the debris. You can see aerial shots of the church, and yes, a corner of it is damaged considerably. There are also shots, though, photos of that church showing on the walls the scarring of small fragments. What would have you would imagine have arisen from a blast of small fragmentation particles, which is what many of these air defense missiles do. The way they operate is that they don't actually hit and run into the missile they're trying to intercept. They get close enough and then they fire out a ring of shrapnel, and those pieces of shrapnel then burst the missile they're trying to take down out of the sky. And that's what appears to have happened in this church. And I think in this apartment building, which appears to have been uninhabited, that's probably what has most likely occurred there too. The Iskanders, interestingly, they do exist in Russia have them distributed. They actually have them in Kaliningrad as well. There's some reports that since 2015, the Kaliningrad, the oblast, which is separated from Belarus and Russia by the border of Poland and Lithuania, where the Suwalki Gap is, an area which now is receiving some additional attention as it appears that Wagner forces in Belarus are being pushed up towards the gap. There's talk that if the conflict continues or expands and NATO or Lithuania may become involved, that the Russians and Belarusians would look to force a corridor along the Suwalki Gap to connect Kaliningrad to Belarus and Russia and allow transfer through that land bridge. Poland have been pushing troops up towards that border just in the last week or so, primarily because of the threat they see of the Wagner forces being there and the possibility of some attempt to secure the Suwalki Gap by the Russians in the future. So anyhow, we'll see. But interestingly, they have these Iskander missiles in that area as well. Other missile attacks in the last day or so. Now, in the area of Taganrog, which is on the coast of the Sea of Azov, it's about 50 kilometers to the west of Rostov-on-Don, which is in Russia. Rostov-on-Don is the military command center for the special military operation for Russia. Now, what is being reported there is that two converted or modified S-200 air defense missiles were used in this strike by the Ukrainians. The Russians claimed that one of the S-200s was shot down over the Sea of Azov. The second one, interestingly, there is video footage of it striking I believe it's a museum in Taganrog, an art museum. There is a Russian claim that it was shot down, intercepted and shot down, and as it fell to the ground, it caused damage. I'm not completely sure if that's really what happened here. Looking at the video footage, and I'm no expert in this area, but the video footage, the S-200 missile appeared to be approaching with speed and with a direction and looking intact. In this case, I wonder if this S-200 made it through the Russian air defences and struck its target, but the Russians may prefer to claim that they didn't miss it, they actually hit it, and unfortunately that caused it to fall. It didn't appear to be falling or damaged, it appeared to be striking. So I think that second S-200 may have made it through. Now, in that case, there were no deaths reported. I think there were about 15 or 16 civilian injuries, but again, I believe all of them relatively minor in nature. You know, I'm still pleased these people have been injured by shrapnel. I'm not saying that people haven't been quite badly hurt, but no casualties from this. So it appears as though it may have sort of struck at the back of this art centre, a car parking area, and there weren't too many people around there. But certainly the strike does appear to have been more of a strike and less of a intercepted fall. What else has happened here? This attack may actually have been not so much an attack by the Ukrainians, a coordinated attack to cause damage, may have been an attempt to reveal where the Russian air defense capabilities are around the Rostov-on-Don area. Now, Rostov-on-Don being the area where the Russian sort of high command for the special military operation are based, would be a prime target for the Ukrainians if they were able to determine that Sergei Shoigu or Valery Gerasimov perhaps were there. However, these two S-200 missiles, now these are air defense, these are older Soviet air defense missiles which have been converted to hit land targets. So instead of going up and exploding near a missile, they instead will now go up and target a ground target. These two, I don't think were a real attack. These would be, I think, more likely an attempt to just identify what may have been operational in terms of air defense in the area and on the path, on the way to there, and that more than likely we would expect to see the real attack involve something like Storm Shadows or the French Scalp missiles, which are faster, more powerful, more difficult to hit ballistic long-range missiles. There was, just in the last 48 hours, some attacks by the Russians on airfields within the middle and towards Lviv into the west of Ukraine. And these attacks were allegedly on airfields where Sukhoi Su-24s were housed. These Su-24 sort of fighter bombers have been modified to be able to carry and then deliver and fire the Storm Shadow missiles. The Scalp missiles are very similar to the Storm Shadows, so they may also have been converted to be able to now fire those. But in terms of this attack on Rostov-on-Don, I think that we want to keep an eye on this area because there may be a future attack, but if it isn't a real attack, I believe it will more likely contain or involve the use of Storm Shadow missiles. There's a report just coming out this morning talking of missiles that the train lines between Kherson and Crimea, there may have been an attack with some Storm Shadow missiles to destroy those train lines. So this isn't the Kerch Strait Bridge, which is the connection between Russian mainland across to Crimea on the southeast of Crimea. This is more on the west, northwestern and northern area of Crimea, where it then goes up and meets onto the sort of Kherson and Zaporozhye regions. So through that area there, it appears the attacks have been made there. I've only just seen the one report coming out. The report is indicating that some damage was done to some of the train area, but not significant, that the Storm Shadow missiles were intercepted, and some of them, when they shot down, caused damage. Again, the Russians have been claiming to have shot down numbers of Storm Shadow missiles. They've reportedly shown video footage of at least one which they were able to bring down in a relatively undamaged state. So I do believe some of the Russian reporting indicating that they've shot down Storm Shadow missiles. However, they haven't been successful in shooting them all down. So again, in this attack, if it has happened today on these train lines, I guess we'll hear more about that later, and see if there was any damage done to the train lines in that area. Now, just moving on from the missile attacks, moving just down to the area of Zaporozhye, the Robotyne area. Now, the last couple of days, there has been devastating failure of Ukrainian armoured columns in these areas. And over the last 24 hours, more and more video has come out just showing some of the losses suffered. There is video there of a column of Ukrainian armoured vehicles. Reportedly, in the main assault that you see in this video, there are some Leopards, Bradley fighting vehicles. And I've spoken about this yesterday, but what appears to have happened is that these vehicles have travelled, making an advance forward, and have arrived in a minefield, a Russian minefield. They also, in the first video I saw 24 hours ago, they appear to have entered into perhaps a minefield, and it looks as though perhaps on either side of them there were Russian forces, perhaps in trenches, or at least on one side in trenches. As there's been more analysis done of the video, and as more video has grown, in additional reporting, I have subsequently seen video where it appears as though the Russians were aware of this advancing column, and they were advancing down from southwards, down from the north, coming up from the south. There's a single Russian tank to engage them, which you see speeding along a road to get towards them. It appears as though it may have been involved in the initial engagement and may perhaps slowed the column down. Like, it may have actually landed a shell on the first vehicle in the column, which then caused them to slow down. And then you see them suffer attacks from both the left and the right, where they have all stopped. They've started to bunch up, but haven't bunched up badly. Now, these attacks on the left and the right, initially I thought were anti-tank missiles being fired by Russian forces in trenches. However, I'm not so sure about that now. In looking at some of the video, at least on one side, the smoke that fires off from the ground towards the tanks and destroys the tanks or the armoured vehicles, in some cases I'm struggling to see any person there firing them and initiating that. And instead, what I think might be involved here is what is known as an anti-tank top mine. These are a PTKM mine. Now, these mines aren't a mine which are the discus shaped things you might all be familiar with, that you can throw out onto the ground, and if you roll a tank over it, they will explode. These PTKMs are a far, far more complex and advanced piece of equipment than that. These, if you imagine a large thermos, like a metal cylinder, about 2 feet tall, they have 8 fold-out legs that support them. You position them, and then you activate them, and they have a number of modes of sensing. So these aren't something which you have to roll over and click a switch and detonate. These will cover an area, a square area of about 100 meters around them, and they have microphones on them and seismic sensors. so that they are able to detect the sound and the vibrations of vehicles passing them. They can compare what they record to an internal database they hold to identify what the vehicle is. So if, for example, a civilian car or just a small car were to go past, they will ignore it and remain inactive. But if something which is heavy enough through seismic recordings that it can detect or sounds like the large engine of a tank or an armoured personnel carrier, they will activate. They're able to swivel and focus on the approaching target. Once that target moves to within about 50 meters of them, they calculate where they are and they then fire into the air about a 3-kilogram explosive projectile. They fire it into the air. It then uses radar and infrared to target the vehicle it's going to attack, and that charge then explodes and forms a shaped charge. So it forms a lump of metal within the explosive to become a shaped charge to then pulse down towards that tank. It's called an explosively formed penetrator. These PTKM anti-tank mines have the ability to deactivate themselves. You can program them so that from 1 to 10 days after they've been set, they will send themselves into a disabled, inactive mode, so they won't pose a threat after that. But this is a whole different type of anti-tank mine. So in this case, you're not trying to identify mines on the ground in front of you and avoid them. These mines won't be diminished or dealt to with a traditional mine sweeper. So a mine sweeping tank which will push through and perhaps push the dirt out of the way and clear those discus-shaped mines, or even one that might operate with a flail which would activate them and explode them to allow vehicles to follow behind. In these cases, you would be driving along in what appeared to be an unmined area, and then once you're within 100 meters of one of these, you suddenly become a possible target of them. So I believe that they may have been involved in part of this attack. Now, in the footage, and I've included a link in the footage in the description in the notes below, in the footage that I saw today, this is from another view, and this is an extended, it's about a 6-minute long clip. What it shows is that this attack, on which is about 8 vehicles, and all of them are destroyed, seems to be one of perhaps 2 or 3 attacks of this nature. As you see from this drone or helicopter, the view panning and on into the distance looking north, you see what appears to be 2 or 3 other areas where, from the telltale smoke on the ground, it appears as though other columns of Ukrainian armoured vehicles have suffered the same fate. So while I can't give you an exact number, it would appear that there were tens or dozens perhaps of vehicles in this footage, in this one area, in this one operation, within a period of minutes, I would imagine, that were destroyed. So the Zaporozhye region, which is where in the last couple of days there were reports that the big offensive had begun, and it appears as though this was a big offensive. As I say, there were dozens, if not scores, of heavy armoured vehicles involved in this fighting. They have suffered terrible losses in the last 48 hours. The Ministry of Defense, the Russian Ministry of Defense, talks about in the last 2 days in this Zaporozhye area, if I'm combining the last 48 hours, they're talking about 300 Ukrainian servicemen lost, 5 tanks, and this is including 3 of the German-manufactured Leopard 2s, 2 French-manufactured AMX wheeled tanks, 20 infantry fighting vehicles, 17 infantry fighting vehicles, 5 armoured fighting vehicles, an M-Star B howitzer, an M777, the US-manufactured artillery system, and a Strela 10 surface-to-air missile system. So this is just in the Zaporozhye, Robotyne, Robotyne area, really around here, and the clashes there in the last couple of days. Now, as I reported recently, the Ukrainians have made an advance here. They have been able to push south down sort of almost to the south of Robotyne. They have effectively flanked and avoided attacking Robotyne. But as I said, they've put themselves in a position now where they are surrounded on three sides. Any decision to push forward down towards Tokmak and onto Melitopol would be pushing down a very thin column deeper and deeper into an area of Russian-controlled land. There seems to have been after yesterday's destruction of their columns, a pause. There may be some activity now where they're looking to move eastwards of Robotyne and push that way. Again, they're likely to, I think, encounter perhaps similar mined Russian minefields. So in the later today, we'll see what happens in this area, and if they have been forced to pause entirely, or if they are likely to try to attack again. But this level of losses of armored equipment within a day or a day and a half in this one area really cannot be sustained. And so it will be very interesting to see what does happen in this area, which is where the big push appeared. The big push was picked up by the Western media that it was starting. Interestingly, now that starts to sound to be being walked back, given that there wasn't a success. There was no push through to Tokmak and Melitopol. It's been stopped at the level of Robotyne. Western media is now starting to say that no, this wasn't the big offensive at all. The Ukrainians are starting to run out of time. They have about 8 weeks. Where are we now? Getting close to the start of August and September, about 8 to 10, maybe 12 weeks before the rain really sets in. There's report of rain in some areas already starting now. That will make big armoured offensives difficult to undertake. It seems as though this push may be over in Zaporozhye, Robotyne area. There's talks of strikes having been carried out by Russian long-range fires onto the western side of the Dnipro River, where there were forces amassing to perhaps make some sort of an assault across the Dnipro River, perhaps at the dried-out bed of the Novokakhovka Reservoir. And that attack appears to have been thwarted by these forward strikes by the Russians. So the Ukrainians really starting to get to a stressful period of time where they're under a lot of pressure to demonstrate some advances before they will have to return to a defensive posture, purely because the rain will stop them from advancing. This will be problematic if this happens in the next 8 to 12 weeks before the middle of October, because there are alleged reports of Biden having said to Zelensky that the Ukrainians have until December to demonstrate successes and advances. Now, the big success and advance that the Ukrainians want is to be able to get through and cut off Crimea. Even if they can do that and suffer heavy losses, but could do that for a period of time, they would then be in a position where they could negotiate with Russia, because they could in effect say, we now have however many people, 1 million or 2 million, how many people there may be in Crimea, effectively a hostage now. We've cut off the water to them, we can cut off the power to them, we can use some storm shadows to take out the Kerch Bridge. They are isolated and under our control. That's what the Ukrainians are aiming for. That's what this whole offensive push through Zaporozhye has been intended to achieve, but hasn't achieved yet. Now, the Ukrainians need somehow to find a way to do that, and they need to do it soon, or they will end up stopping their advance. They'll end up not making their advance by December. And Biden is in a position where he wants to probably wash his hands of this, because he's going into an election in November 2024. If he can't demonstrate success for all the money that's been invested in there, then he's going to need a scapegoat. The scapegoat will become Zelensky. It will rapidly in America the story will turn that the US did everything they could. They gave everything they could, and the Ukrainians were corrupt. They were inept. They failed, and they wasted the American dollars. And that will be the end of the support for Ukraine, because Biden wants to win the next election. He's got terrible approval ratings. He's suffering from dementia. He's being challenged by Trump. He's being challenged from his own party by Robert Kennedy Jr. So he has real problems on that election front, and he will want to do whatever he can. What he doesn't want lingering around is an unsuccessful campaign into Ukraine that has cost the American taxpayer hundreds of billions of dollars. So with all of that going on, there are reports, growing reports now, of a Russian mobilization. And the numbers, while I was earlier reporting of maybe it was 150,000, the numbers that are starting to be reported now are well in advance of that. Simplicius the Thinker has another great article out, and I will put together a report more on this Russian mobilization later. But in the numbers that he's discussing, his headlines there, it's that it may involve up to 500,000. Now, the mobilization that occurred in September of 2022 for the Russians had some challenges, some logistical challenges. However, the Russians will have learnt from that. So if they have done a mobilization of 300,000, if they are getting a continuing stream of volunteers, which has been reported upwards of 10,000 a week, then they, I believe, would be in a position to now mobilise 500,000 if they wanted to. They would have worked out the kinks and the problems from the original mobilisation of 300,000. There are reports of contracts with Chinese armour and personal armour and helmet manufacturers, orders of 100,000 units each for body armour and helmets. So I think the Russian mobilization is looking more and more likely. And again, the talk is that it will be ready by the autumn. So this is the Northern Hemisphere autumn. That's September. So just at the period of time when the rains might be setting in, when the big column advances might be slowing down, Russia might be turning up with an extended 500,000 troops and equipment to accompany them, to be able to just push and grind on the Ukrainians, perhaps up until December, when, if this reporting that Biden stopping the aid at that stage is true, the Ukrainians will be put into a position where they will have to either accept the Polish and Lithuanian requests for them to put Polish and Lithuanian troops into the ground to support them, and run the risk that they may end up with an occupying force of Polish forces in their western oblasts, or they may have to negotiate at that stage with Russia, and it would be in a position where the Ukrainians would not hold Crimea, the Ukrainians would be on the back foot, the Russians would have a massive force, and negotiation would be on Russian terms at that stage. This is perhaps the worst case scenario for Ukraine and the West. I'm not saying that this is going to happen, but this is one of the possibilities that's looking more and more likely at this stage. All right, thank you if you've made it this far. I really appreciate you watching this. I hope you're enjoying the channel. If you haven't subscribed already, please subscribe, tell your friends. I look forward to talking to you again soon.